excited to welcome to the stage Oberlin's own Robert Bosch.
All I can say is, wow, this is incredible. I never envisioned when I was a student here, 81 through 85, that I'd ever be standing on this stage. And in fact, setting up this talk was the first time I've stood on the stage. I can remember sitting right up there in the balcony, November 1st, 1981, watching one of my favorite bands, King Crimson, played a concert here in Finney. It was really loud, it was really wonderful. I have so many memories of being in this beautiful chapel for concerts, for convocations, for assembling for graduation. When we have our commencement ceremonies, the faculty assembles here and then walks out 2 by 2 through the doors onto the square. I'm just so thankful to President Ambar for inviting me to do this. Oberlin is such a special place for me. I met my life partner, Kathy, here when I was a freshman. This sort of thing happens. You may have heard of that. I highly recommend it. I have received so much support from the administration, from the faculty, my colleagues in the math department, computer science, and the students. The absolute best thing about Oberlin are its amazing students. Let me just say a little bit more about that. This book that I've been working on, this project that I'm going to be talking about right now, made use of the efforts of so many Oberlin students. I've written papers on this subject with these students listed here. I've worked with other students. I've gotten so much from them. Oberlin's such a great place, so I'm just so proud to be here. Let me jump in then to the topic itself. As Carmen said, I specialize in optimization. Optimization is the branch of math and computer science. It's an interdisciplinary field that's concerned with optimal performance, finding the best way to perform or complete some task. Some tasks are more suitable to mathematical optimization, some aren't, but there are many, many tasks that can make use of math and computer science-based approaches. We all use optimization every day indirectly, whether we're aware of it or not. Whenever you order something from an online retailer, we are making use of their supply chains, which are set up by mathematical optimizers. So that's what optimization is. What is this weird thing, opt-art? Well, I have coined this term. I consider it to be visual art that's constructed with math and computer science-based optimization techniques. Is that kind of weird to do? You know, to blend together mathematics and visual art? Well, I would, of course, contend it's not weird. It's completely natural. On the math and CS side, we have this, that optimization is one of the best tools we have for managing the many constraints we face in life. When we perform some task, what makes that task difficult, typically, is the constraints that govern the rules that enable us to see if we've completed that task correctly. So the constraints can make the problem an easy one, or that can make the problem a hard one. So that's optimization from the math CS side. What about from the art side? Well, optimization comes in 2 ways. One is through constraints. I believe that all artists face constraints. In fact, all human beings face constraints. We have to deal with limited resources. It's a fact of life. One example of constraints that artists might face is like a deadline. Well, we all face deadlines. But more than that, if you're a painter and you choose to paint with oils, that's certainly a lot different than painting with watercolor. If you carve wood and you use a soft wood like bass, it's a lot different than using a hardwood like oak. If you're engaged in painting or carving, you have to pay attention to the physical medium that you're working with and the physics of the constraints that involve working with that medium. But some artists not only choose to enjoy the challenges of working with those physical constraints, but they go farther and they self-impose additional constraints to challenge themselves. Here are some of my favorite quotes from various artists and creative people. Henri Matisse, the painter, Much of the beauty that arises in art comes from the struggle an artist wages with his, her, their limited medium. Joseph Heller, author, wrote Catch-22, was interviewed by the Paris Review. In that interview, he paraphrased T.S. Eliot and wrote, "When forced to work within a strict framework, the imagination is taxed to its utmost and will produce its richest ideas." Adding constraints makes not only things more interesting, but can yield some unexpected and interesting results. And I wish I had music playing for this one. Igor Stravinsky said, "How could you not be inspired by this? The more constraints one imposes, the more one frees oneself of the chains that shackle the spirit." That's lovely. What I'm going to do for the bulk of this talk is two things. I'm going to introduce you to some classical applications of modern mathematical optimization, two examples, and I'm going to alternate the discussions of those classical applications with how I've adapted those applications to produce what I find to be interesting and beautiful artwork. So let's start with the first classical application of modern mathematical optimization. This is known as the linear assignment problem, and this is the most math-heavy part of this. When I present equations, you feel free to ignore the equations. I will express the ideas behind those equations out loud. And the math is really contained in those ideas and those descriptions. The notation is kind of the equivalent of like a musical score. You can enjoy music without being able to read music. You can enjoy math without understanding the mathematical notation. So what is this linear assignment problem? Well, there might be some people in this room who've been chairs of some department. I was chair for 1 year. It was really hard. It didn't suit me well at all. One of the tasks that a chair has to do is assign professors to teach classes. So this is a small, quote-unquote, toy example of that. We have 5 professors. I'm not naming any names. I'm just calling them P1 through P5. I have to assign them as chair to teach 5 classes. Again, I'm not giving the names of these classes. I'm just calling them C1 through C5. And so I want to pair up professors with classes, form an assignment. And what's my goal in doing this? Well, I want to minimize the total amount of complaining that goes on. And by that, I mean the total amount of complaining done by the faculty and also the students and the administration and parents and everybody. So some total amount of complaining. Measured on, let's say, one way to interpret these numbers is a 1 through 5 scale, where 1 is low complaining, 5 is high complaining. Or it could be the number of headache tablets that the chair has to take over the next week in order to deal with all this complaining. So, it would be pretty bad if we were to assign Professor 5 to teach class 1, because that's 4 headache tablets that chair is going to have to take. All right, so what do? We just go ahead and select some of the pairings. Professor 1 to teach class 5, 2 with class 4, and so on. And we just add up the numbers that correspond to those pairings, and we get a total cost, 16.5. That's a lot of headache tablets over a week. We can do better. This is a lot better. If we do this instead, we've reduced the chair's intake of Tylenol to 11.5 tablets. That's quite an improvement. Can we do even better? Yes, but we need to use some mathematics. Now, this is the same assignment, that same diagonal assignment, but next to each cost value, I have a multiplication sign, an asterisk, and a number in blue that's either 0 or 1. The ones represent, yes, I've made this pairing. I've assigned this professor to teach this class. And the zeros, nope, I don't want to do that. That's a bad idea, okay? So these blue numbers are essentially values of what's going to be an unknown or a variable. So the problem is really this. I don't know which assignments to make. I don't know if Professor 3 is going to teach class 4 or not. So I model this by using these binary variables that are denoted xij. Xij is going to be interpreted as if it gets the value 1, that's interpreted as meaning that Professor I is indeed paired with class j. 0 means that that didn't happen. So instead of what we saw right here with 1s and 0s, I'm leaving those things unknown, and I'll turn this problem over to a computer solver to solve this problem in the end. What's the total cost in terms of these unknowns? Well, it's just like what we did on this slide, but with xij's instead of zeros and ones. So it ends up being this big formula, and you might think, oh, that's a big, nasty formula, but it's really not. It's about the simplest type of big formula you could come up with. It's linear. Each unknown has just a number in front of it. And we haven't done anything fancy to those unknowns. We haven't squared them or raised them to some other power or done the sine or cosine or anything. This is just a linear expression for our cost. And we want to make this as small as possible. So mathematically, that's our goal. That's our task. Can we assign anything that we want to these values? No. I might want to give every single class to Professor 1. Maybe that would result in the lowest complaining. But Professor 1's not going to be happy with that. And the other professors probably wouldn't. And the whole thing would be really quite a big problem. So if I focus on the unknowns, the variables that have to do with Professor 1, I got to make sure that exactly one of these takes on the value 1 and all the rest take on a value 0. And mathematically, one way to do this is to add up those unknowns that correspond to Professor 1 and force their total to be 1. That makes it so one and only one of the classes gets Professor 1. In other words, Professor 1 teaches one and only one class. Now that's the constraint, that's the mathematical constraint, the equation for Professor 1. Of course, we have to do the same thing for the other professors. So write down an equation for Professor 2, Professor 3, Professor 4, Professor 5. What about the classes? Should I do something similar? What's it going to involve? Instead of going like this? You can use your arms? Yes, thank you. Yeah. Okay, we're going to do that. So those are the unknowns, the variables that deal with class 1, x11, x21, x31, and so on. And we're going to add them all up, make the total be 1, force it to be 1. That will make sure that class 1 gets one professor. And I'm going to do that for the others. So what we've done so far, we've seen that this problem of assigning professors to teach classes has, it turns out, 25 variables here. They're all binary. They're all xij's, 1 if the professor teaches the class, 0 if not. We've got a linear cost function that we want to minimize. We've got 5 constraints that make sure that each professor teaches one class. We've got 5 constraints to make sure that each class gets a professor. We've got constraints that force each of these unknowns to be binary, 0 or 1. And hopefully we can solve this thing, this mathematical optimization problem. And fortunately we can. This type of problem where the xij's are binary is known as an integer programming problem, in particular a binary integer programming problem. And these problems in general are quite hard. This one has a very special structure that makes it quite easy. We can, for computer scientists, we can solve this in polynomial time. We can do this very quickly, obtain solutions to this. And that happens to be the optimal solution for this small example. So we can shave off half of a Tylenol tablet. The best we can do is have the chair doing 11. All right, so that's the first example of a classical application. What about the art? Well, I've said opt-art is what I call art constructed with or designed with math and optimization-based techniques. When you were coming in, you saw a mosaic being made out of dominoes. This is a mosaic that was made out of 3 complete sets of double 9 dominoes. So in here, if you look for it, you can find exactly 3 blank dominoes. There's one there, and there's one somewhere else right there vertically. If you focused on the 9-9 domino, a domino that has 9 dots on one side, 9 dots on the other, you could find exactly 3 of those. I'm not going to try and find it, okay? So there's exactly 3 dominoes of each type. By the way, this domino artwork is not my invention. My method for doing it is my own, but the first person to ever do these domino mosaics is a scientist / artist named Ken Knowlton, who worked for Bell Labs back in the 70s and 80s. He's considered one of the father figures of computer graphics. So this is domino artwork, kind of a la Ken Knowlton. How do we go about designing these domino mosaics? Start with a familiar image. So this is a publicity photo of Boris Karloff, who played Frankenstein's monster in maybe several Frankenstein movies. This one was from the movie The Bride of Frankenstein. And you can see here that I've imposed a grid on it. I've divided this image into 22 rows of squares and 15 columns of squares. So I've divided it into squares. Now each square is made up of pixels. Each pixel has some what's called a grayscale value that measures how bright or dark it is. And these are just integers from 0 to 255. 0 is black, 255 is white. Individual values that are grays, that are in the middle. So if I average all those grayscale values, what I can do is convert this picture into a collection of integers from 0 to 9. Now, why would I do that? Well, remember, I'm going to be using double 9 dominoes that have 0 to 9 dots on them. So using a grayscale that has numbers from 0 to 9 in it makes a lot of sense. Going back and forth, focus on the forehead. The forehead is the brightest region. That got 9s. 9 white dots on a black domino, that's the brightest you can do. Focus on a dark region, like right below Frankenstein's monster's chin. That's pretty dark. Those are 0s. Focus on some, in-between square. You get some number that's between 0 and 9. So 0 is black, 9 is white. In-between values are different shades of gray. The larger the number, the brighter it is. So where are the dominoes? Well, we need to put them down. I could do that, put 2 down. Whenever I place the dominoes down, they will cover 2 of the numbers. And I will need to assess whether I've done a good job. If you focus on the one on the right, that 8-2 domino, the 2 and the 8, the 8 is covering the 7, the 2 is covering the 3. It's off by 1 in each case, not too bad. Okay, now how does this connect with the material that we talked about before, the professor class assignment problem? Well, I'm about to get to that. I just want to point out that when you're constructing one of these domino mosaics, you have a choice. You can position dominoes vertically, or you can position them horizontally. And there are actually 2 different types of dominoes. There's dominoes that have the same number on each side. Those are called double dominoes. They could just be placed vertically or horizontally. There's no other options. But the non-double dominoes, like this one here, this I would call the 0-1 domino. I could place it vertically in 2 ways, the 0 up top or the 0 down below, and horizontally 2 ways, 0 on the left, 0 on the right. So with the non-doubles, I have more options. Okay, now into the details. Remember in the professor class assignment problem, we had xij was 1 if professor I teaches class j. Here we have something like that. It sounds horrendous at first. xmnoj, okay, got that straight? That's 1 if domino mn is placed in orientation O, so it could be vertical or horizontal or some variation of vertical, some variation of horizontal. And I gotta say where the domino goes. I gotta say perhaps that its top left square covers a certain square of the board, a square in a certain row in a certain column. So this will make sense with some examples. What have I just done here? Well, it's the 3-3 domino. So it would be x33. It's been placed vertically, so I could write x33v. And the top left square of that domino covered the top left square of the board, square 1, 1. So really what I've done here is I've set the variable x33v11 equal to 1. Now, I could have also placed it horizontally, and that entails setting the variable x33h11 equal to 1. So what you're seeing here is that kind of like the professor assignment class, professor class assignment problem, I have a variable for everything that I could do. There it was assigning professor to a class. Here it's placing a domino somewhere down on the board. There's a lot of variables in this problem, it turns out. And whenever I make a placement, I need to decide if it was a good placement or not. So let's talk about that briefly. So go back to this horizontal placement. Is that a good placement to make? Well, I got to compare the left 3 with this 2, and I got to compare the right 3 with the 5. 3 minus 2, yeah, that's 1. That's not so bad. 3 minus 5, that's minus 2. That's worse. I can't add the 1 and the minus 2 because, I really want positive penalties. So I do what statisticians do. I do a sum of squares type of thing. So the cost of doing this particular placement ends up being 3 minus 2 squared plus 3 minus 5 squared, and that gives me a total cost of 5. This vertical one, I'm comparing the 3 here with the 2, the bottom 3 with the 3, 3 minus 2 squared is 1, 3 minus 3 squared is 0, total cost of 1. This is a much better placement. And I can compute all these cost values, these CMN OIJs, for every single one of my variables, which correspond to every single way I can place a domino down on the board. And then I just have to think about the constraints. Oh, the objective, minimize the total cost. It's like the professor class assignment problem, just add up all the cost values times the unknowns, just as we did there. So it's again a linear function that we're trying to minimize. What are the constraints going to be? Well, think back to professor class assignment. In that problem, we had constraints that made sure that each professor taught one class. Okay, if we think of dominoes as professors, then we got to make sure that each domino is used the right number of times. Not just once, but if we've decided ahead of time to use S sets of dominoes, maybe S equals 3, like in the example, we got to make sure we use exactly S copies of domino Mn. And we got to do that for each domino Mn. So exactly S blank dominoes, exactly S 0, 1 dominoes. If the equation bothers you, ignore it. The idea is that we're just doing the analogous thing to what we did with the professors. Well, in the professor class assignment problem, we also had to pay attention to the classes, make sure they each receive one professor. The thing that's playing the role of the classes here are the individual squares of the board. They each need to be hit by or covered by one domino. And there's a pretty complicated way of writing that down mathematically, and you can safely ignore that. But the basic idea is that we have a variable for every way to put a domino down on the board. We want to minimize the cost of this placement. We got to make sure that every domino is used the desired number of times. We got to make sure that every square of the board is covered once and only once. This is very similar to being one of these linear assignment problems, but the fact that we can move things vertically or horizontally makes it slightly out of that realm. But fortunately, it's still relatively easy to solve these problems. It turns out, just to give you a sense of size of these problems, if I'm using one set of dominoes, the number of these unknowns, the number of these XMN OIJs, is about 20,000. If I'm using 3 sets of dominoes, then that's like 60,000 variables. If I'm using 100 sets of dominoes, that's 1 million variables. And all of those problems can be solved these days on a laptop within minutes. So it's a wonderful world we live in. All right, so there's the optimal solution for 3 sets. And now I want to just show some examples of this artwork made out of real dominoes. You can see this perhaps it's still up in Eastwood Elementary in Oberlin. This was made in 2002 in the open room, which was run by Sharon Blecker and Gail Burton. Absolutely wonderful classroom. Mixture of first and second graders, 36 of them all, including my son, Dima, that's him, when he was in there. He's now 24, almost turning 25. And for about a week, back in January 2002, several math majors came with me. Michael Henley also came, and we worked with these students for about 3 hours a day, and they ended up assembling this mosaic out of real dominoes using the plans that I had provided. It was a great experience, a lot of fun. Since then, I've put the plans for this mosaic up online on my website, dominoartwork.com. They're free PDFs of these plans, and schools throughout the country have done them. So here's another example, same plans, same mosaic. This is done in San Francisco. The photo was taken by Lance Iverson of the San Francisco Chronicle. This installation was done at George Washington High School in San Francisco, which just coincidentally happened to be the high school that my mom went to when she grew up in San Francisco. So that was kind of nice. And we see a few pictures of that. Here's the largest one that I've ever made, 48 complete sets of double 9 dominoes. It forms a likeness of a famous mathematician, Julius Peterson. Mathematicians will know the name. He discovered / invented what's known as the Peterson graph. He was from Denmark, and Danish mathematicians really revere him. I went to a conference in Copenhagen in 2013, and I was asked to do this. And it was a real struggle bringing this from Oberlin. I can talk about that later if we have time. I prefer to have other people build them. I like to design the plans and then see what happens. I like to, in effect, exploit the labor of children. So here we have the result of my friend Julian Flarin, who teaches at Westfield State University in Massachusetts. Right after Barack Obama was elected in 2008, I was super excited, as were many, many people here at Oberlin. I made plans for doing a domino mosaic of Barack Obama out of 44 sets of dominoes, 44th president. And Julian saw that and asked if he could do it, and they got all the students at this elementary school involved. They made it a part of their math classes, their art classes, their social studies classes, and they really liked this, you can see. And that was their final framed version that I hope still hangs there, or maybe it's been moved to some other location. I was aware of that, but what I wasn't aware of is that another group of children had built this as well. I got an email from a mom whose kid was getting treatment at the Detroit Children's Hospital, and it turns out that that same summer of 2009, some staff members at the Detroit Children's Hospital found my plans and decided to use it in the hospital for a group of kids who were HIV positive, who were staying at the hospital receiving treatment. These kids were suffering, and the staff was looking for something they could do to lift their spirits, keep their minds off what they had. And it's now hanging there, and you can't see it too well, but it's hanging in the Detroit Children's Hospital. You walk down on the lower level past the cafeteria, and you see Barack Obama giving you a thumbs up, and they like it there, and that makes me just incredibly happy. Okay, so I've given one example of a classical application of modern optimization. I've given one example of art related to it. Let's move quickly through a second example of a classical application, and that's what's known as the traveling salesperson problem. This is the most well-known, well-studied problem in the entire field of optimization. And the task that is being addressed here, that's being proposed, is that you have to plan a tour through a given point set. So I have 20 dots here labeled with numbers from 1 to 20. These, think of them as locations. If you like, you can imagine yourself as a volunteer for a Meals on Wheels organization. You happen to live right here, or that's the location of the Meals on Wheels Center, and then you have to deliver meals to the 19 other locations. In what order do you visit them? If you choose poorly, you're zigzagging all over your town, and you're spending more time than you would need to. You're putting more miles on your car than you would have to, using more fuel, putting more pollutants into the atmosphere. So it's definitely a good idea here to make your objective be to minimize the length of your tour. And by tour, I mean just a single loop through all those points. So you could start at one, visit them in some order, visiting each one once and only once, and then returning home. So we want to find the shortest possible tour. That's known as the traveling salesperson problem. The unknowns here, what are they? Well, I'm going to use binary variables, zeros and ones, just as I did in the other applications. Here, xij is going to be 1 if points I and j are adjacent to each other on the tour. So if there's a straight line segment connecting points I and j. So for example, I've just set x213 equal to 1 because in this tour, cities or locations 2 and 13 are next to each other. Look at city 9, city 12, they're not adjacent to each other, so the unknown x912 actually is 0 for this tour. Now, each of these segments, each of these possible adjacencies has a length associated with it, a geometric length, so I could call that geometric length Cij, and then the length of the total tour will be the sum of theCijs times the Xijs, just as we had in the professor class assignment problem. Now, what constraints do we need? I'm not going to present any equations here. What does this tour have that makes it a tour? Well, if you focus on any one location, just locally, if you could zoom in, you can see that it touches two tour segments. In effect, when you're traveling through the tour, there's a way into that location and a way out. If you're touring cities in Europe and you decide to enter Paris, you must leave Paris. You might not want to, but you must, okay? To be able to go on to Vienna or Amsterdam or whatever. So we're going to have constraints, and it turns out that there are equations to make sure that every single point is touched by 2 segments of the tour. Well, that satisfies that set of constraints. Each point here touches 2 tour segments. Could we do this? No, this involves teleportation. You can't just magically go from the cluster here over to here. So we have to, in effect, break these quote-unquote subtours. And it turns out there's simple linear inequalities that we can impose. That doesn't look so simple, but the idea is to think of this collection, this subtour, as like an entity by itself. And the same idea that we talked about with locations, there has to be a way in, there has to be a way out. That same idea can be applied here as well. There has to be a way into this blob and a way out. So the number of these tour segments that go from the blob to the outside world has to be at least 2. In fact, it has to be even. You could go and visit it and then come back and leave it, and, that sort of thing. But if we impose these constraints and we do it in a clever way, then we can build software that will solve these traveling salesperson problems. And I have access to really good software for doing that, and that enables me to create some nice visual artwork based on it. So I like to start again with some familiar images. These are based on iOS emojis. So we have the emoji for the smiley face with sunglasses, kind of the happy, feeling cool emoji. And then we have the stressed out one. So how many people feel this way now? How many people feel this way? At this time in the semester, more of us are feeling this way than feeling this way. But it's Parents' Weekend, so hopefully we're more here. I can interpret this as a traveling salesperson problem. I can imagine that I'm a salesperson who lives right here, and I have to visit all the others and then return home, making the shortest tour possible. And thanks to having access to really good software, there's software called the Concord TSP solver, written by a team led by Bill Cook at the University of Waterloo. We can get these optimal tours. Each one is just a path through the points. It doesn't cross itself anywhere. Wherever you start, it will return to where you started. Artists would refer to these as continuous line drawings. And when I started making these, I just became obsessed with doing them. Became a full-blown obsession. Oh, incidentally, if you use the Concord TSP solver on a 5-year-old laptop, it takes about 10 minutes to find these tours. So it's a reasonable amount of time, I think. Here's another example, 2 more emojis. Again, I don't know if I mentioned 1,024 dots. There are the optimal tours for them. We can go bigger. It will take more time for the solver to find an optimal tour. This tour forms the likeness of a well-known mathematician, Irish mathematician, by the name of William Rowan Hamilton. And the reason I did a Hamiltonian cycle portrait of Hamilton is because these tours, another name for them, is a Hamiltonian cycle. That's what mathematicians call these things. That's one of the many names that mathematicians use. So we have a Hamiltonian cycle portrait of William Rowan Hamilton. And then, I don't know what you think about puns, but I love them. I also did a Hamiltonian cycle portrait of Linda Hamilton, the actress who played Sarah Connor in the Terminator movie. So there's another Hamiltonian cycle. And I couldn't resist doing one more. Anyone see Hamilton on Broadway? Lin-Manuel Miranda, a Hamiltonian cycle portrait, a version of him. Each of these had 4,096 points, 4 times as many as the emoji examples. These took much, much longer to solve, 3 days-ish on this laptop. I would bring my laptop to class. Some students here might remember this, and they'd say, "What's your laptop doing?" It's making a lot of sounds. It's churning away. Oh, it's working on this stuff. More examples. In addition to making what you could call computationally intensive puns, you can actually produce some work that I think has some emotional heft to it. Here's 3,072 dots that are arranged to form the likeness of a portion of the Sistine Chapel creation scene painted by Michelangelo. So you've got the hand of Adam on the left, the hand of God on the right. From a distance, or if you squint, you see that these hands are not touching. Maybe they've just touched. Maybe this is just after creation. You can connect these into a single loop by solving this traveling salesman problem. And you can use this to assert that Adam and God are connected, even though from a distance it might not seem that they are. And I've produced many variations of this, one in which the connection is more clear. Someone who stares at this might not be certain that they are connected. So I have a version where it goes directly from one fingertip to another. And that version is intended for those of little faith. I also have a version where it's actually two separate subtours, an atom subtour and a God subtour, for those who might believe that God, set the universe in motion and then just hasn't cared about it at all since then. But this is the only one that I wanted to share with you. This is a piece that I did sort of in tribute to M.C. Escher. There's a famous M.C. Escher of his hand drawing another hand. Both hands are drawing each other. So I took a picture of my hand drawing a labyrinth. It was surprisingly hard to do, And then I solved the traveling salesperson problem for this. But I didn't draw every single little segment of the tour. As mathematicians are fond of doing, I left the completion of the tour as an exercise for the viewer. This one has a great deal of meaning to me. I have this printed out very large and it hangs in my house. This is my father and me back when I was 5 years old. He passed away when I was 6. It was based on this teeny tiny photo. The photo is about 2 inches across, 1.5 inches high. I did some Photoshop work to remove the background. I think there's somewhere between 10 and 14,000 dots. And I view this as asserting that my father and I are still connected. It's just a single loop, so we're connected. Bill Cook, who designed this software that I use, this Concord TSP software that I use, invited me in 2009 to create some challenge problems for the entire TSP research community to work on. And this is the smallest of the 6 problems I designed. There are 100,000 dots here, and so the problem is to find the provably best way through those dots. It's an immensely challenging problem. A Japanese computer scientist named Yuichi Nagata found this tour shortly after Bill put this up on his Mona Lisa TSP Challenge website. And Bill writes that he writes about the progress that people have made in the TSP research community since then. And I want to identify 2 things. The length of Nagata's tour is 5,757,191 distance units. Well, what's a distance unit? It depends on how big you print the thing out. You could print it big enough so that a distance unit would be 1 millimeter, but it would be, maybe fill the stage. So that's the length of Nagata's tour, but these researchers done even more. They don't know if this is the best tour, but they know that if there's a shorter one, it's not shorter by more than 107 distance units. So 107 is pretty small compared to 5.7 million. I asked Bill, a while ago how much more effort they would need to put into this to find the optimal tour, because I'm interested. I created this problem, and he said probably years. And he's told me that millions upon millions of years of computer CPU time has been devoted to studying this problem. So I've, depending on how you look at it, either actively engaged or wasted the time of all these TSP researchers around the world. I like to play with this stuff. I like to impose additional constraints like the artists that I mentioned. I'll get to the imposing additional constraints shortly. But I like to just see from an artistic standpoint what I can do with a line. What can you do with a line? Well, artists know pretty much anything. And I've discovered that with my playing around with this stuff. If you focus on this piece and squint your eyes, you might see a black chord that is knotted. It's a Celtic knot design. It goes over itself and under itself, over itself, under itself. But if you get up close, you see that it's just a white line that doesn't cross itself at all. It's not knotted, hence the title Knot with a question mark. This is another in that same series, and you'll note here that there are 3 colors. Wow, there's some color in some artwork here. Everything else has been black and white. Well, any one of these TSP tours, any one of these Hamiltonian cycles, any one of these simple closed curves, these are just different names for the same thing, mathematicians have proved that these objects, these mathematical objects, they cut the plane into 2 regions, an inside region and an outside region. So in effect, they're cookie cutters. So they cut, got a big piece of dough, you do your cookie cutter thing, and you've got the inside of the cookie cutter, your cookie, and then you got the leftover, the outside piece, which is your scrap dough, which you can mash up and make more cookies out of. So what we see here in red is the cookie, the inside of the tour, and the black is the outside. Let's see. Here's another one. This one's called outside ring because that ring in the center, that circle, is actually on the outside of the tour. If you were to find yourself deposited somewhere in the black, you could essentially solve the maze that you're in and work your way out to what most people would think was the outside, the black stuff on the edge. All the examples that I've shown so far have been produced by just drawing these tours and maybe filling them in on the screen, or you could do it on paper or canvas. But there's more. I've lost track of where I am. You can play with symmetry. So here's where I was mentioning additional constraints. I can force the points to have some symmetry, because maybe I'm interested in certain repeated elements emerging. And if I force the tour itself to also have repeated elements, encourage symmetry, I can get this. And the nice thing about the symmetry is it results in sort of a color exchange symmetry type idea. You have these little heads in white on a gray background, and you have little heads in gray on a white background. And you see those little heads everywhere. That sounds creepier than I intended. But then in addition to doing that and drawing it, like we just saw, we can have a computer control some device, like a laser cutter or water jet cutter, and we can produce pieces out of metal or particle board. So this is a sculpture that I did back in 2009, 2010. It won first prize at an art exhibition in San Francisco. I should clarify, a mathematical art exhibition, much smaller. But it's a really neat piece. The way it was produced, you have a 6-inch disc of brass. That's your sheet of dough. And then you have a computer-controlled water jet cutter. It shoots a very thin stream of water at the metal. And it's powerful enough, moving fast enough that it can cut through the metal. So the computer controls the device so it traces the path followed by the salesperson. And in effect, it's a cookie cutter. You would never cut dough this way. It would be a mess. But you can cut metal this way. And you end up separating your brass piece into a cookie, a brass cookie, and a brass piece of scrap dough. And then you can do it again with stainless steel. So start with stainless steel. It's like using, vanilla dough and chocolate dough and mixing them together. I should do that someday. And you end up with a, stainless steel cookie, stainless steel brass dough, and then you just swap. So what we see here is the stainless steel cookie inside the brass dough. And it's a really lovely piece that you could give as a wedding gift. And I gave it to my brother as a wedding gift. When telling a friend in the mathematical art community that these pieces that I make ideal wedding gifts because they show how two beautiful things join together to produce something beautiful. My friend made a comment, said, "Oh, they're also perfect divorce gifts." You have beautiful things separating into two beautiful things as well. Each person has to take one of them then, I guess. I don't know. Here's another picture, some other examples of this done with a laser cutter and particle boards. So the light particle board is called MDF, the dark particle board is called hardboard, and those are the two pieces together after the swapping. This is just the outside piece of scrap dough, the MDF. This is just the inside piece of hardboard, the cookie. This is both of them together, rotated so that a lot of the stuff that's in the MDF is hidden. This is one reason why I like to use symmetry, so you can do this kind of thing. And then when you smush them together, you get, I think, a nice looking design. I've probably used more time than I should have. I want to, as Carmen did kindly, promote my book. I will be in the lobby shortly to sign copies if anyone's interested. If you're not interested, but you're marginally interested, go to your local library and ask them to order a copy. That would please me just as much as buying a copy. At this point, I would love to encourage you to come forward to the microphones, both here and here, if you have any questions. Before then, I just want to thank you for your attention. This has been just a great experience for me. Thank you very much.